May all that you stand for and that we stand for be preserved under the providence of God for the happiness of mankind.
The trouble is caused by unthinking people who carelessly throw away ageless ideals as if they were old and outworn machinery.
But it is the values of individual liberty, equality before the law and the supremacy of people over the state to which we can always with confidence return as a powerful and uniting force.
Australia is not a secular country. It is a free country.
Good evening and welcome to Pellowe Talk. We've got a slightly improvised format tonight. I want to keep this show happening. We've had a little bit of a break, basically because we're putting so much effort into getting lots of articles and podcasts to you all the time that the day and a half that it takes to prepare a good show in the way we've done it till now just isn't possible. And so we'd rather keep up the excellent articles and podcasts coming to you all the time. However, what we are going to do for Pellowe Talk for a little while and see how you like that, your feedback's welcome, is actually review some of the articles that you may not have seen, that you may not have gotten. You might not be into the articles as much as you are into YouTube and the videos. So this is why we're going to do a live show. Also gives us the chance to interact with you and hear your comments and questions as I bring the authors from the week's most popular articles and podcasts onto the show, and we go into depth a little bit further with them. So to welcome to Pellowe Talk tonight, please welcome Dr. Anthony Dillon, Alexandra Marshall, and Joel Aegis. Welcome, everyone.
Hi.
You got to say hi. Testing microphone.
Well, I could make a comment on your shirt, Dave. You're very Hawaiian tonight.
You like my flowery shirt? It's not Hawaiian. It's a little bit more this year than that. But anyway, I'll pretend I'm not mortally wounded by that.
Show us. You and my commentary, it's your own fault.
I'm not selling my shirt, but you are selling yours. Show us that wonderful merch you're sporting this evening, Ellie.
Yes, this is part of the Dear ABC Go Fund Yourselves range, which is the conservative way of protesting the government, and it fits in with the article that we're going to discuss later. But now
just rise up a little bit so we can see the bottom half of the print, hopefully without falling off your chair like you did before.
Oh, Wyatt. You got to join behind the scenes to see that. No. So it's just a simple hoodie. They come in lots of colors, and you can get them from the link in my Twitter profile,
which is @EllieMelly, the link to get some great stuff. Rusty says, "G'day, mate." And Pearl Miller says, "Hi" as well. Hello, Pearl. Lovely to see you, and Rusty as well. Well, let's have a chat about the first topic tonight. I think I can help you bring that up, or have I gotten rid of it? No, there it is. Add to stream. All right. Anthony Dillon's wonderful article that we shared recently, and with his voice narrating it, is Australia a racist country? And I'll just open it up a little bit. The title for this article is a question, and one that relates to Aboriginal people. So when I, Anthony, talk about whether or not Australia is a racist country, it'll generally be in the context of Aboriginal people, unless otherwise stated. And he asks the question because he frequently hears that for Aboriginal people, Australia is a racist country, quote unquote. It's an important question because if Aboriginal people believe that Australia is racist against them, then that would certainly dampen their enthusiasm for participating in mainstream life and relationships with other Australians. Anthony, you go on in great detail in the article to talk about what evidence there may be that Australia is a racist country. Tell us a little bit more about, just recap that article for us, please.
Okay. First of all, this is an article, I don't believe I narrated it. You had a lovely lady do that for this one.
Oh, we got Ellie to do that?
Yeah. So just in case, if people hear the voice and they think there's something strange about Anthony. That's
I'm
the
sorry.
explanation. Okay.
I'm sorry.
How dare you forget that I got through that weird quote at the end?
Yeah, there
but
was
look,
a difficult quote there. You did well, Ellie. I'm sorry to
It's-
do you both a disservice.
well, it's good to see the face behind that voice, and the face seems to be as lovely as the voice. So it's nice that we're on this show together.
You will go far.
And one thing we should say about that article too. Look at the photo you've got there, David. Can I tell people who that is?
Yeah, of course.
Dave and my dear friends, Dave and Bess Price. Okay.
You actually mentioned them in the article as a great example of the way Australians are not racist because of the commonality of interracial marriage.
And yeah, absolutely. I mean, my parents, for example, but that's Dave and Bess, so it's lovely to see them there. And, I guess the crux of the article is to answer the question, is Australia a racist country? No. Are there instances of racism? Yes. But that doesn't mean Australia is a racist country. And I think too often when people hear that question, is Australia a racist country, they translate it into, is there, instances of racism in Australia? The answer to that is yes.
Yeah.
And I think I'll give an example there. You could have some shark attacks in Australia, but it doesn't mean we've got shark-infested waters, because there's a few shark attacks. Yes, there are certainly instances of racism against Aboriginal people and other minorities, but not, in my opinion, not to the degree which warrants us calling Australia a racist country. And I'm happy to be challenged on that. If someone's got some good evidence to suggest that Australia is a racist country, that, the prevalence of racism is high, I'm happy to hear it.
Yep. And what is the best arguments that you hear, being an advocate of I guess the I'm trying to think of the right adjective, but the quality of Australian life, that racism is not prevalent. It does occur, but it isn't systematic or systemic.
Systemic,
Then what are the arguments you hear against those? What's the best arguments you've heard for the contrary position?
Against my position? Well, when you say best, I don't think any of them are best. Again, they might just point out, well, two things, I guess. They'll point out to an instance of racism, whether real or imagined, and say, see, that's proof. Or they'll, that's proof that Australia's racist. Or they'll point to some inequality between groups, like, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people incarceration rates, for example. There's no denying there that there's a huge difference in the rates. But that alone doesn't necessarily prove racism, unless of course, you want to broaden the definition of racism to mean, any inequality at all, which I think is absurd. So that would be the two big ones, I guess, giving an example of racism, saying, see, there, Australia's a racist country, and pointing out to some inequalities and concluding that must be the result of racism.
Yeah. Joel, I'm interested in your experience as a young fella. What are the best arguments you've heard going through high school and uni, which would be the best evidence you think that, I guess I'm going to generalise, that leftists are the ones who will hold that Australia is a racist country? What are the best arguments you've heard them make to support their case?
I think, I wasn't involved as much in sort of those sort of topics in high school per se, but particularly with my communications degree I'm doing at the moment. I haven't done the subject yet, but there is a subject coming up that looks at that Indigenous Australia and and I think we're going to have to actually write some sort of story on an Indigenous nature, on Indigenous issues and all that sort of stuff. And I can already see that, students are probably going to end up, particularly because the universities and the education system is such a hive mind of leftist individuals, particularly with professors and all that sort of stuff. They tend to lean more towards people, they want to hear about racism and all that sort of stuff. And I think they've sort of devalued the word in that sense, in that they throw it around so often now that they're making things out to be what they're not. And I think I can see going into that subject probably next semester that there's going to be, instances like I would want to write a story that actually covers the real issues going on in Indigenous communities, rather than write something that's just sort of, sticking along the lines of race baiting and all that sort of stuff that they want to do, that they probably want us to write, in a sense.
Yep. Okay, so Anthony, we've got the comments here in your article from Jerry Georgatos, and you've said that not many people have written more about racism against Aboriginals than him. And to quote him, to bring the contrary view into the conversation, he stated, a quote, "I see the racism in all its forms, institutional, structural, and overt. Racism has haunted me from day dot. My predominant academic work, including doctoral research, has been in understanding the racism and the ways forward." And further, "There is a culture of racism in this nation so extreme, odious in its stench, the likes I have not known elsewhere in my many travels outside this continent. Of all the middle and high income nations with relatively recent colonial oppressor histories, Australia has the widest divide of all measurable indicators between the descendants of its first peoples and the rest of the population. The racism in Australia burns so deep that it not only threatens life, it takes lives." Now, you asked him to justify those claims. Can you tell us how he went with that effort?
No. First of all, Jerry's a lovely fellow, really nice guy. And when I hear what he said, it was basically just truth by assertion. And he conflated, again, that the disparity between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, again, I'm not disagreeing with that. However, to sort of lump it in with racism. And as we just heard a minute ago, James, is it?
Joel.
Joel.
Yeah.
That, the word is losing its meaning.
Yeah.
So, but coming back to Jerry, who, with his doctoral research to my knowledge, that's never been completed, but that's aside. It was basically just truth by assertion. He said it, so it must be true. It's been my experience, and certainly when you speak with Aboriginal people who try and push this racism narrative, or what I call the blacktivists, they will just say, "Well, it's my lived experience." And again, when they say that, it's as if you're not allowed to question it. As soon as they say lived experience, end of conversation. You're not allowed to challenge them on it. So he was unable to justify his claim. It was truth by assertion, and he left it at that.
Alexandra, David Burkett asks, "Do you think Australia was racist in colonial times? And if yes, do you think we currently adequately address our peppered past with truth?"
Well, if you take racism as meaning that cultures and races, I use the term race, we're actually all the same race, we're actually clines. But if you take the idea that cultures treat each other differently, well, then every culture is racist because it's part of tribalism, where we actually are slightly hostile to our neighboring tribes. And that was a protective measure. It doesn't mean we openly hated each other, but we are not all the same culture. But in Australia, it was one of those unique situations on a global historical level where the people who colonised Australia came here with the express intent of creating a united, free nation. And the whole purpose was to include the Aboriginal citizens as citizens of England and to bring everybody eventually into being Australian. So it wasn't a conquering mentality that you saw all across the world. And indeed, between other Indigenous cultures across the globe, it was probably one of the only examples ever in history of trying to create an equal and non-racist civilization going forward, and a peaceful one as well. But talking about this guy's comment about inherent racism, I've just finished studying a lot of Asian politics, and I tell you what, if you want to see what real systemic racism look like, go to China or go to any Asian country. They are very racist cultures, and that's why they are predominantly homogenous in their race. I mean, China locks other races up into concentration camps and harvests their organs. Like, if you want to see what racism looks like, that's racism, as are the poor white farmers in South Africa who are murdered and tortured with the permission of the government. So to try and claim that on this global stage of humanity that Australia is one of the most racist countries on earth is simply categorically false. There's nothing to back up his claim in the slightest.
Anthony, I think there has to be room in these conversations for the word tribalism. And I think there's a normal and even acceptable human behavior, which I call tribalism, and it's very different from racism. So to define my terms, what I mean by racism is the belief that an individual might have that because of their race, they are inherently superior and worth more than somebody else, another individual, because of them being of a different race. I would say that's racism. It's toxic and it's pernicious, and there's probably different forms. But tribalism, I think, is a normal human behavior where we inherently trust people who are like us. So, I mean, you see this in religions with denominations where you actually get people who are just wanting to be birds of a feather flocking together. It's normal, for example, it's normal, for example, to prefer to do commerce and business with people who are like you. Might be people who have the same skin color, people who speak the same language, people who support the same football team. So there's this tribalism thing, which I don't think is something that we should pretend doesn't exist or that it's always bad. Ellie, you want to jump in, but I'm keen to hear Anthony's thoughts on the differences between normal tribalism and toxic racism.
Yeah, look, I would agree with you basically. And, you know, it's that tribalism has been there since the caveman day, where you kind of had to stick with your group and fit in with them because, you know, other groups were just seen as, you know, different and therefore a danger. So, you know, I wouldn't disagree. You know, what's the difference? You know, I guess the race element, where, you know, race is a distinguishing feature.
Ellie, what are your thoughts? You wanted to jump in.
Just on the definitions of tribalism, I only just finished running through a large study on it, and accents are part of our tribalist nature. It's one of our most ancient instincts of humanity that we have. So we use accents to help determine differences in different tribal groups. And the reason is we can never tell if we're going to trade with another tribe or if they're going to attack us and steal our things. So it's part of humans' ability to protect each other, but also to recognize where people have come from, who they're actually interacting with. It's not necessarily a bad instinct, it's just an instinct. And an example would be, well, you know, like it's also, sorry, let me just put it this way. It's part of also our diversification, how human evolution wants us to diversify as often as possible. So when you separate a human group, they start to change. And one of the things that changes is our tribal instinct to group together into a coherent new tribe. And that's exactly what happened to Australia. We are now different to the United Kingdom. We became a new tribe. Yep. It's not a bad thing. It's the foundation of nation building.
Yep. Yeah, very true. Very true. Well, just finishing off this topic, Joel, do you have any other thoughts on racism and Anthony's article?
I think it was a very well-written article, honestly. I think, you know, a lot of people don't get to see the side, particularly the media these days. You know, they don't really want to portray the side of the argument that Anthony's, you know, written about. And I think, you know, they really just want to buy into the hype around racism and you know, push it further to try and, I guess, in some sense, divide society and, you know, have more people divided against each other. So, yeah, that's...
Well, Anthony concludes his article by saying, yes, there is racism in this country against Aboriginal people, but it is not as widespread as activists or those whose income is coincidentally dependent on believing it would have us believe. A preoccupation with racism simply prevents us from tackling the real problems affecting Aboriginal people: housing, health, employment, etc. And this nice comment from David Burkett also sums it up. As long as there is people and sin not dealt with, racism will continue. Human nature is another way of saying that. You're always going to get immature jerks. Having travelled the world, I can see that Australia does really well, one of the best, but every nation must deal with racism. It doesn't matter how prevalent it is, all racism is sin and wrong, of course. Well, let's have a look now at Ellie's very popular article, which was...
Dave, can I just give one concluding comment on that?
Please, Anthony.
Where there's racism, let's deal with it. But let's not create racism or try and portray racism existing where it doesn't exist. Let's not just automatically assume something's racist because two different people of two ethnic backgrounds are involved in some sort of clash.
Yeah, a perfect point of that was Derek Chauvin and George Floyd. Widely assumed that was a racist incident because two people involved were of different races. And yet there was absolutely no evidence or even assertion made by the prosecution in that case that there was any racism. There was no claim, no assertion, and no evidence of racism whatsoever. And the whole media narrative that's gone on is just completely baseless. Like, you're 100% right, Anthony. I mean, we want to fight racism just like we want to fight, every other evil social behaviour which is destructive to human flourishing in Australia. We want our neighbours to do really well. So, yeah, show it to us and we can fight it. But don't come with these fictitious claims that everything is racism, because that's just silly, and it doesn't do actual fights against racism any help at all. Well, let's flick to that screen again, and we've got a picture here which is worth 1,000 words with an article from Ellie Melly just asking whose ABC is it? And in the picture, there's a couple of dozen of people in get-up shirts and branding, all demanding that the ABC be left alone, if not extra funded. Let's have a quick look at that article. Ellie opens, the ABC is a greatly loved essential media service. The ABC would immediately collapse into oblivion if it went behind a paywall. These two things cannot be true at the same time. There has always been a general political divide in Western nations that sits around 50-50, half left, half right, depending on the tone of the era. And as a government-funded entity bound by law to be politically impartial, the ABC is meant to use public money to provide a service for all. Those who love the ABC claim that, of course, it presents a balanced opinion, while the rest who think it's a waste of money feel physically sick when they are assaulted by clips of its shows left carelessly floating around the internet. And didn't we see a great example of that this week with some drag queen teaching children all about his preferred view of the world? This is an easy question to resolve. If half the public hate it and half the public love it, the ABC is, of course, a political platform. Defund the ABC hashtag has been trending for some time because half of the population who hate the ABC are sick of funding a political propaganda arm of Labor and the Greens. Considering how tightly controlled election budgets are, it seems unreasonable that a proper democracy would allow its publicly funded broadcaster to swing a sledgehammer through the free press to protect its favourite MPs. Ellie, without reading the rest of the article, although we could take the time and enjoy it right now, why don't you sum up exactly the arguments that you're making there, and then we can throw it open for discussion.
You're just frightened to read my jokes, which are coming up, and I had to fight you on. That's why
right. There's a little bit of cussing in there, you naughty girl.
Oh, I wasn't going to let you cut those ones out. Yes, so this was written in the week where Defund the ABC, or Go Fund Yourselves, if you have my train of thought, was trending for quite some time. It was after the Four Corners episode where they tried to basically put this slanderous campaign out against Scott Morrison. Like, I'm not a big fan of Scott Morrison, but this was a ridiculous publication by the ABC. And more people are becoming frustrated with what is clearly a political organization and media service operating on $1 billion of public funding every year. Now, this doesn't matter so much when everyone's got loads of cash, but when people are becoming increasingly poor, funding what is essentially political propaganda that acts against the public interest is becoming a hot topic, especially when, I don't know if you saw today, you've got ABC journalists egging on Gladys, trying to get her to lock down Sydney. That destroys people's jobs. Meanwhile, the ABC reporters who are doing it remain on full salary, just like politicians. And so people are wondering whether or not it's time to put them behind a paywall and make them compete in the free market. We're no longer in the war scenario of last century where we needed a public broadcaster because no one could afford to set up their own press company. Those days are gone. There's plenty of competition out there. Anyone, even kids in their basement, can have a media source at the moment. So the question of the article really is, first of all, is it political? Which I don't think there's any context over. The public already display whether they like it or hate it. And the second is, should it go the way of the BBC, where people are given a choice whether or not they want to fund it?
How does that actually work, the voluntary funding of the BBC? This is fascinating. I didn't know that was a thing until I read your article, and I'd love to know more.
So the BBC doesn't work like the ABC, so they don't get given massive public handouts from the government every year. Instead, they get their money from compulsory license fees for everyone who owns a TV that's connected to the network. Now, they had two problems. The first is my generation, and particularly Joel's generation, don't own TVs. And so already they've got a whole, 90% of the new generation aren't going to be paying license fees. But then what
can you break down for me how the license fees work? Like, is it an annual fee to get a particular channel, or?
No, it's an annual fee. It's about £100 and something. It's not cheap. So it's a lot of money. And that's what, so you know how we have free to air, we don't pay for it. They have to pay to be connected to the network, but they get connected anyway, and then they get back charged the fee. So people go in, they plug their TVs in, and then they get charged for being connected to.
How do they? I actually want to know how they measure it, how they stop or start the service.
Don't know. It's something to do with the government does surveys on it, and they know who's connected and who's not by how many households are connected to the wire. It's like your gas and electricity. But the problem is, people were complaining about the license fees, and so they had to make them voluntary. And so if you disconnected your TV, you could go and send the government a message saying, hey, I don't have free to air anymore. I'm not paying my license fee. And that's been happening in their millions. Every year there's more and more disconnecting themselves. And so the BBC's budget's getting completely slashed. People don't want it.
Brilliant. Wow. England's leading the way on something finally. It's taken a while.
One thing, they got something right.
That's incredible. Joel, do you think we can introduce some kind of voluntary funding for the ABC in Australia? We don't have the same kind of, can we opt in with our taxes or something?
Yeah, I think we should. I mean, I think people should be able to allocate, where their taxes are going, because I think, if the ABC is just going to keep, breaking away from its charter and spruiking leftist ideals all the time, then realistically they're not representing everyone in Australia. And so why should conservative people on the conservative side of politics fund something that's, not relevant to them, or, doesn't really speak for them in a sense? Even, I mean, a lot of they claim to be balanced and all that, but, and, their supporters will rabidly go on and say, oh, it's balanced, it's all good, but clearly you can see that every time, they have a panel show or something like that, they might bring on one token conservative, and it'll just be an all-out attack on that individual from everyone else on the show. So, yeah, I think we should privatize it, and it should be opt-in or whatever. But I mean, then again, I think, if we did that, I don't think it would last long, to be honest. I think the viewers aren't really, willing to pay
Joel
for the service.
Has nailed it. He's absolutely nailed it. Any discussion you have with someone online who wants to defend the ABC, if they say everyone loves it, it's absolutely essential service, but no one will pay for it, which goes against the idea that it must be widely loved and essential, because it's got no market value whatsoever.
Anthony, what do you think? Do you think there's enough of a demand for the ABC to keep it going, even in a trimmed back version?
Look, we need to keep it going because people, those people need their voices. We shouldn't be suppressing them at all. I don't like the ABC. That's about all I can say on it. Let them have their say, but we've got our voices and we can, counter what they're saying.
But is there a difference between suppressing them and subsidizing them, or not subsidizing them to the point? So I wouldn't want to stop them having a say, but I just resent them putting their hands in my pocket so they can.
Why don't they compete in the market with the rest of us?
Let them start a YouTube channel.
Exactly. We have to do it. Why don't they have to do it?
Yeah. Or, I think Tom Switzer wrote about it many years, 6-7 years ago, privatise the ABC.
Yep. Yeah, that'd be good. And, I mean, it's just... I think you said it, Ellie, in your article, and we've said it before on this channel, is that if they just stuck to their charter, A, we wouldn't have a problem, B, it wouldn't cost so much. There's just so much superfluous, like, for example, propagandizing children in gender theory is just an unconscionable departure from the charter to provide essential services in the lack of a competitive commercial space.
It actually does two things. It stops the market from having pure competition because it's paid by the state. That's a massive state entity operating in what should be an open market. And the second thing, one of your commentators pointed out that how come the ABC is left when we have a Liberal government in power? And that's because it's actually funded by the bureaucracy that does not change within election cycles. Those are the people who really sign the paychecks, and they are of the left. And that's why the ABC continues to be left-wing and funded during a Liberal government.
So tell me one more thing about the UK licenses, Ellie. Is it one license for free-to-air TV, or is it a license per channel, or is it just a license for the BBC and they get other channels for free?
You know what? I've never actually looked at their free-to-air channels. I know that every household, it's for every TV in the household has to have the BBC license if they're connected to the network. If they don't, they get fined for it, unless they have already written to say, I've disconnected, I'm not interested. So I'm not sure if it's for all of free-to-air or even how their free-to-air works over there, but I know that it's specifically to do with the TVs in your house and whether you're connected to them. And I also know that they used to give pensioners either for free or very cheap, and they've stopped doing that now. And so increasingly pensioners are also disconnecting themselves.
Wow. Gee.
Which probably wasn't a good move because they're probably their most stable customers, and so they're out.
Yeah, mind you. Rusty Woodpecker says we need to keep it going under Australian privatisation. And I think this is a good, I haven't heard this comment before, international corporations could be worse for us than it currently is. They could be CNN.
Honestly, I don't think it matters. As long as I'm not paying for it, I don't really care what they do.
Really? Couldn't get so bad that you'd have an objection just as long as you don't pay for it?
It can't be worse than Media Watch, can it now, Dave?
Oh, I don't know. I think it could be. I think it gets pretty shocking in there. All right, let's have a look at this next article. How do politicians convince so many voters to support lockdown? And this one's written by me. Now, I'm not automatically comparing these people to Nazis, but you'll see why in a second. It's actually very relevant and not a stretch at all. So I wrote, I'm a huge believer in freedom, and the loss of freedom experienced globally since the great COVID-19 experiment began last year is as alarming to me as it is inexplicable. I just don't get it. How are people okay with this? Conservative people that I know, they're okay with it. How can so many educated, intelligent citizens of nations which have so long enjoyed the greatest combination of freedom from tyranny and economic prosperity ever seen in world history so easily surrender those freedoms with not even a whimper These freedoms have not just been easily but enthusiastically given away. In part, our immense national prosperity and the far-flung remoteness of any wars for many generations now goes some way to explaining the lack of value we place on our personal autonomy, our freedom to work, travel, assemble, protest, or worship. The 18th century American political activist and theorist Thomas Paine observed, "What we obtain too cheap, we esteem too lightly. It is dearness only that gives everything its value." But I don't believe it's that simple, that we've simply forgotten what social carnage the tyranny of kings and collectives can do to a nation because we don't value freedom as much as the generations which shed blood for it. I believe there's actually a much deeper quirk of human psychology being relied on and cynically manipulated by our leaders. Allow me to explain and present the evidence, and please tell me if there's a better explanation. In my article, I explain all about freedom, my philosophy of it, theology of it, and why I think it's important. But it's quite a long article, so I won't go into that right now. To the question of why so many voters have enthusiastically embraced lockdowns, etc., and presumed a moral superiority even to anyone daring to question the government's orders, even reporting their neighbours like good little Stalinists, I want to consider with you the relevance of the learnings from the Milgram obedience experiment. In 1963, Stanley Milgram, a psychologist at Yale University, examined the excuses given at the Nuremberg war criminal trials by Nazis accused of war crimes. And actually, what I'm going to do is just play this video of footage from the experiments while I read this. That's nice and quiet. Good. So the Nazis infamously claimed they were just following orders and had no choice because of the authority their superiors had over them. Milgram wanted to know if Germans were particularly inclined to unquestioning obedience to authority figures, because that was a popular narrative in those days, attempting to explain the Holocaust. Unquestioning obedience to authority figures? To me, that sounds just like the average West Australian, Victorian, or Queensland voter, hence why this experiment and its results are extremely relevant half a century later. The aim of the experiment was to see how far people would go if their obedience to an authority figure meant harm to another person. How easily could people be influenced to actually participate in the kind of atrocious human rights violations they would normally condemn? The Milgram experiment always involved three people. One was a learner, one was a teacher, and one was the researcher. The learner would go into one room and have electrodes attached to his arms, and the teacher and researcher went into an adjoining room where the teacher could speak to the learner via intercom. The teacher would sit at a console which had a row of switches to give the learner electric shocks with 30 levels from a mild 15 volts to a really dangerous, almost lethal 450 volts. And they would flick the switches as instructed by the researcher if the learner gave an incorrect answer. But there was no real electric shocks being given. The learner was always an actor, and the researcher was in on the ruse. Only the teacher believed he was really giving electric shocks to a complete stranger who would then respond with increasing sounds of pain and pleas for mercy. Every time the learner made a mistake, the teacher was told to give him an electric shock, increasing the level each time. When the teacher eventually got uncomfortable and refused to administer a shock, the researcher had prepared 4 responses he had to read out in order each time the teacher continued to refuse. Remember, there's an actor in the other room going, "Ow, ow, stop it, my heart, I can't bear it, I've had enough, I want to go." So the teacher would refuse, and then the researcher would have to say one of the following 4 things each time. "Please continue. The experiment requires you to continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice but to continue." Well, guess how many people aged between 20 and 50, ordinary people ranging from unskilled workers to educated professionals, continued to administer all the way up into the severe shock level? All of them. Guess how many participants continued to the highest level, the dangerous, lethal level, as a matter of obedience to authority? 2/3, 65%. Now, I think it's interesting that in November 2020, Premier Daniel Andrews enjoyed an approval rating of 71%. Dr. Stanley Milgram varied the experiment in 18 different ways to see how the participants' obedience was affected in various situations. Milgram later commented on his study, quote, "Stark authority was pitted against the subject's strongest moral imperatives against hurting others and, with the subject's ears ringing with the screams of the victims, authority won more often than not. The extreme willingness of adults to go to almost any lengths on the command of an authority constitutes the chief finding of the study and the fact most urgently demanding explanation." Milgram suggested that people have two different states of behaviour socially. The autonomous state is what we do normally. It's when people take responsibility for themselves and choose their own actions. But the agentic state is when people agree to be agents for other people who will bear the responsibility and consequences of the actions they direct. Agency theory says people will obey an authority when they believe the authority will take responsibility. Here's a kicker. When the Milgram experiment's participants were told they had personal responsibility for their actions, almost none of them were prepared to obey. But if the researcher present in the room assured the teacher, the subject, that he would take all responsibility, many subjects who had initially refused did go on. Anthony, you are a lecturer in psychology. What's some of the classic discussions you've heard about this experiment?
Well, in recent times, people have re-examined the data, or at least the hypotheses, and what may be working behind the scenes. Because often in experiments, there's a lot of flaws that we don't realise. But putting that aside, let's suppose that it was what we saw it to be. There's some differences between that and what we see happening today, Dave. So I don't know if it's that great a parallel. It certainly has parallels, but you spoke about the hidden identity of the person, administering the shocks or whatever. But I just want to make one comment about autonomy. A person can still, have their options reduced and still feel autonomous if they endorse those actions or those restrictions. So, for example, with the lockdowns, for example, if for argument's sake, if I honestly believe it's a good thing, it's going to save lives, it's going to prevent people from being sick, well, then I'm endorsing the behaviour, the restrictions that are given to me. If I'm endorsing them, I still have autonomy. So I just wanted to make that distinction. But one of the differences here, there's no arbitrariness. We know that there is a virus. Now, how prevalent, or the incidence of cases, the severity of it, a lot of people will disagree, but we know there is something there called this COVID, this virus. So therefore, you're kind of prepared to a degree that, okay, it's going to mean modifying our lifestyles in one way or another. Where that line is of what's acceptable, varies from person to person.
Sure. Ellie, what do you think? Do you think people are able to vary their responses and risk managements autonomously, or does it need to be a one-size-fits-all mandate for an entire nation deprived of basic freedoms?
Okay, so what we're seeing is only possible because of fear. Now, fear is the most powerful tool that any government has. And there are two major expressions of behaviour that you see under fear. The first is with an imminent crisis where there's an immediate threat to harm or death. Now, humans will straight away look for an authority figure, whether that be their parent, an adult, someone who knows who looks like they know what they're doing, or a government official. So that means, there's a massive tidal wave behind us, and you look at the person who is pointing at the exit and you run. So that's how fear-mongering and a war economy works, where you are following the directives of a leader, almost blindly. And that's the group mentality mob that you see, and that only lasts for so long because humans will only sustain unquestionable loyalty while the imminent fear appears to be around them. Now, the second, which I think is more prevalent at the moment, is humans' tendency to be risk adverse. That means we're always looking at ways to avoid risk to our personal safety. Now, if we think the government is going to harm us either financially or physically, unless we root out and punish other people in the group who are disobeying orders, then a lot of us will enforce the orders of the group to protect our own individual selves. And so that's about group harmony inside a tribe. This is all basically, it's very ancient ideas that we use to preserve our group. Now, that is not necessarily a bad thing to preserve the harmony of group and the safety of group, but it can be misused by governments who are basically authorizing incorrect or misleading or bad objectives and encouraging the group to enforce that on their peers. And so what we're seeing now is the second one play out every single day. And there's a third group who will basically refuse to adhere to it. They may not do it openly, but they'll sit back and wait until the group tide has turned, and that's how you end up with revolutions. That's the basic structure of how fear works and how it eventually topples over. Does that help?
Yeah, definitely. Let's have a little bit look more at some of the experiment details. In total, there were 636 subjects who participated in 18 variations to the experiment. In the baseline study, which I described, the researcher wore a lab coat representing what today's premiers like to refer to as an expert and the best medical advice. In one variation, the researcher was called away to take a phone call right at the beginning, and he was replaced with someone not wearing a lab coat. The obedience level dropped from 65% to just 20%. In another variation, the experiment was conducted in some rundown offices rather than the impressive Yale University, and obedience dropped to just 47.5%, another indicator that the perceived status of the authority figure helps many people abdicate personal responsibility, critical thinking faculties, and autonomy. What's very interesting is the varied condition of letting the subject, the teacher, instruct someone else to press the switches. When they did this, when they had that option, their obedience to the maximum voltage of 450 volts then increased to a whopping 92.5%. Conversely, when the learner was brought into the same room as the teacher and the teacher had to personally face and force the learner's hand down onto a charged metal plate, obedience more than halved. Seeing the consequences of their actions firsthand made people less likely to obey the experts with authority. Now, the support condition may be the most encouraging for those of us who think some resistance is due. If the subject had two other teachers present, also played by actors, and the first refused to obey at around the 150 volt level, and the second refused to go to 210 volts or past that level, then with that kind of support for resistance, the rate of obedience fell to a mere 10%. Now,
you see, that's exactly what we're talking about. The way they dress and the circumstances they're in is risk averse. So if a human thinks that the person has more power over them, they will obey the command because they're frightened of the impact of not doing it. If they are face to face with the person that they are harming, they have to judge the risk of the retaliation for the person they're injuring versus what will happen to them from the person doing the instruction. So it's an interesting way that experiment actually highlights this human behavior of risk averse behavior that we often dress up as morality, but often it's just, will I get punched in the face by the person I'm hurting, is what it really comes down to.
Yeah.
For most people.
Any thoughts,
Which
Joel?
is sad, but true.
I'd say I agree honestly with what Ellie was saying before about how they're using fear as a means of actually instilling compliance in a sense. And I think if you increase people's fear, they're more likely to actually do what you want them to do. But again, as Ellie was saying, if you put them face to face with the person that they're, that they could be harming, then a lot of people I think would start to wonder whether what they're doing is right, and they would question themselves and question those actions. And I think, you know, if you've got authority figures there, and, you know, as you said in the article, a lot of people like to, you know, the politicians, they like to talk about listening to the experts, and, you know, they're people who just follow along blindly with them instead of doing their own sort of research and all that. They'll repeat those sort of phrases. They'll say, trust the experts, listen to the scientists, trust the science, all those sorts of taglines. And what I think people don't realize is that those people, those scientists, those experts and all that, they're also human beings. And at the end of the day, you know, human beings aren't necessarily perfect. And, you know, there's obviously, I think Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who wrote the Gulag Archipelago, he wrote in his book that the line between good and evil, it goes right through each person's heart. So in that regard, there's always a chance that that the experts aren't going to do the right thing by the people. And, you know, it creates this shift where people are just going to listen blindly to essentially advice that is just going to further divide society.
Can I ask Dave a question about your article? Here's what I don't get. The people who, on both sides of politics, who hate their politicians, who have just spent the last, 50 years going about how rubbish and useless they are at absolutely everything, and wouldn't even give these guys, you know, charge of a stationery cupboard. When it comes to COVID, they'll do whatever they say. Literally anything they say, both sides of politics. How does that work? I understand how fear works. I don't understand how they can go from not trusting somebody at all to completely trusting somebody on one issue. That's what I don't get.
Well, I think it's got to do with this obedience factor, that they're more afraid of questioning authority and having to take responsibility for them making a mistake. Like what if lockdown was the right thing to do, which it clearly wasn't. And we knew this beyond all shadow of a doubt September last year. I did the interview with Professor Doug Allen a couple of weeks ago. That's up on The Good Source. And he's analysed the academic papers of over 80 different experts who've analysed this and lots of data sites and done a report summarising essentially the effectiveness of it. And there's just so many bad assumptions and premises in their modelling that it was rubbish to begin with. But we actually had the data so that the modelling wasn't that needing to be relied on. Within 6 months, we had the data from around the world saying lockdowns at best have a marginal, trivial benefit. And yet we know that the cost is just enormous and not justified. And one of the biggest problems that the models had was assuming that people would all not change their behaviour in the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of massive government advertising, information and education, that people would all continue to behave normally, which is just stupid. People know how to manage their own risk, and some people have different risks to manage. And so the one-size-fits-all approach was hugely destructive, and it also didn't allow for the fact that people aren't rocks and they do respond to external stimuli. And when you tell them there's danger, they listen. Does everybody? No, but nor was it possible to get 100% compliance in the face of this kind of legislation. It was terrible to begin with. But what I think, and Anthony, this is your area, but my 2 cents is that people were afraid to question the government and to question the people in the lab coats who were telling us that this is the best medical advice and the science says a Anzac Day flyover is a spreading risk, and children going to school is a spreading risk, when science actually said the complete opposite. there's so much evidence that they have been arbitrary in their pronouncements, and they're just not willing to question each decision one by one. And in the absence of questioning them one by one, they just accept the whole lot. What are your thoughts, Anthony?
Again, just one of the differences between this and Milgram, for example, we do have this thing called the virus. Okay. And we see statistics on it, albeit perhaps a bit exaggerated when we say 5 people, there's been an outbreak or whatever.
Sure. Yep.
One
person in Australia dead this year.
All I'm just saying is, it's not just someone saying do this, but rather it's do this because look at these things that are happening. So and
no doubt. I'm not saying we should be cavalier and reckless and go about life as normal. I'm saying we should change our behaviour, but that's got to be different for everybody. And certainly, what the government has mandated has been a ridiculous response that's incredibly destructive. And the reality is, there's been pandemics many times before, and I need to cite this and find a reference for it properly, but I believe I've read that at no stage was lockdown a planned response by epidemiologists in a response to a pandemic. It was never planned at all. The first people to come up with it was Xi Jinping.
Only at its source. So the official advice is that at its source, while the virus is containable, lockdowns are recommended. If a virus is wild, it is never recommended because it can't be achieved because the virus is beyond containment probability. But
and
you're
that was
right.
Recommended prior to 2019?
Yeah, well, that would have been like you should lock down Wuhan City while the virus is in Wuhan. That's what would make sense. But you wouldn't lock down the globe. Once it gets out into India and Africa, I mean, there's no point. It's too many people. You're never going to get rid of it.
Right.
But your point is correct, Dave. Like, the government tells us not to smoke because it'll kill us. People still smoke. Doesn't matter that people die from it. People still do it. There's more going on than just a real risk associated with the government mandate. This is a complete abdication of all of your rights and freedoms on the say of the government. But it might be because there's no way to protest. Like, how do you go against the government mandates when we don't have a system that lets us do it? We can't vote them out. We can't unvote the mandates. We're not given a mechanism by which we can actually, apart from storming Parliament House, what can people actually do? And maybe that's why they comply, because they can't afford the fines.
One of the criticisms of the Milgram experiment was ethical, and it broke a lot of ethical guidelines that we would now, standards that we would now have. You'd be happy to know that all of the people who were teachers were eventually debriefed that they didn't actually torture anybody. And there were some people who were very visibly distressed and even had some health symptoms themselves when they were going through this, but they were all fine.
So they should be. And so they should be for doing that.
A year later, Milgram followed up with them, and most of them reported that they were happy that they had been part of it. But one of the criticisms ethically was that people should have full information full disclosure when they participate in an experiment, and the option to stop at any one time. And Stanley said, well, the option to stop was part of the experiment. I couldn't give them that option. I had to tell them to keep going because it was a test on obedience. And he said, but nonetheless, they did still have the option to stop, because something like a third of them, I can't remember the exact number, but there was a significant percentage who did and walked out. Oh, no, yeah, it was a third of them. They refused to go all the way. They stopped no matter being told that they had no option, and they left. So I think the reality of the virus, I think, is, if you forgive me, Anthony, I think it's a bit beside the point, because it's not a new situation, but it's an entirely new response to an old situation. We've got a very valid concern that we should be changing our behaviour.
Yeah. At least it's being presented in a different way, as something different to what's been done before, or different to what has happened before. I'm not agreeing with lockdowns, by the way.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a shame. It would have been fun to argue it.
Well, the one you're looking for, Dave, is well, I know why the government reacted the way they did. It's because it's been dry run twice at the Davos and World Economic Forum thing. So they've actually brought our governments and our officials through what to do in a pandemic twice now. And so they just, as soon as they saw the pandemic in China, they went through their pre-organized steps, which included mass lockdowns. So that's why you had a united response across the world, because they were basically conditioned to do it. But in previous centuries, like the Black Death, for instance, it killed a third of citizens of England. But afterwards, it basically started the end of feudalism, because it didn't destroy England. It created a free market economic shift. And the government then tried to mandate working relations to preserve the old system. They went into a full authoritarian thing to try and control the situation, and it didn't work. It's the free markets and allowing choice in pandemics that actually recovers the economy and recovers civilization faster, not the urge to control it.
Yep. Awesome. Well, let's have some final thoughts. Joel, you first. Alexandra, you next. And Anthony, we'll finish up with you. Final thoughts for the evening. Joel?
I think we're in a time now which is still, there's still a chance for people to understand what's going on and do their own research into matters. And I think, it's important that we do that in this day and age, because, we can't just put blind faith in politicians and in, unelected bureaucrats and those sorts of people anymore. We really need to step up our game in that sense and think for ourselves. And if we can do that, then I think a lot more people would sort of start to, realize the realities of the harsh sort of lockdowns and restrictions and all that sort of stuff that governments have used this virus to impose on others. So I think, we can be wary of that. And I think we just need to privatize the ABC as well. So that's, I think that needs to happen very soon.
Yeah, indeed. We need to get Ellie's shirt, Dear ABC, go fund yourselves. Ellie, show us the shirt and wrap up for the evening.
Yes, if you buy any of these products from my site, there's also mugs, men's shirts, women's shirts. They go to supporting my writing, because I am an independent writer. It is my income and my job. So not only can you annoy the ABC, you can also help me continue to be a writer. But Joel is right. You shouldn't trust your politicians. And if they feel the need to silence you on social media to prove their point, then they probably haven't got a good point at all. So, and a big shout out to Fu, who's another good source writer who just joined us. So good night, everyone. And thank you for joining us.
Chris Hewitt says he loves the shirt. Anthony, your final thoughts for the evening.
Yeah, look, certainly with COVID and everything else, things are changing. We live in a different world. Will we ever get back to normal, or what's the new normal going to be like? Things are changing. So all I would recommend to people is, in the midst of all this change, try and keep an eye on those things that are unchangeable.
Like what?
Okay. Our basic needs as humans, our connectedness with, our connection with other people, the need to look beyond ourselves, that sort of thing.
Yep. Brilliant. Thank you very much, people, for contributing to The Good Source, writing your articles and popping in here tonight. That pretty much wraps us up for the evening. Thank you to those people who have shared the post and the video. It's wonderful having your comments on the page. Thank you to the Good Source supporters who put their hand in the pocket and make sure each month there's a little bit coming through to help fund the ongoing production. Make sure you fight fake news by buying Ellie's merch and by subscribing to our newsletters on goodsource.news. And we will see you next week.
Today, we need a special kind of courage. Not the kind needed in battle, but a kind which makes us stand up for everything that we know is right, everything that is true and honest. We need the kind of courage that can withstand the subtle corruption of the cynics, so that we can show the world that we are not afraid of the future.